Well, welcome to week 1, Roots of Modern Thought. This is video number 2, the second video indicated that you should watch for this week's sort of overview of assignments and the content of the course. The last video we watched was just really a welcome and an orientation to the course and prayer. This video, like other videos that will be posted throughout every single week of the course, is really designed to give you an overview of the assignments for this particular week and kind of encapsulize what we're hoping to learn together in all this reading and content consideration. On your class schedule, you'll have every week of the course outlined, and within the boxes for each of the weeks, there's going to be a view, review, read, other reading, and do designation. Each of those has assignment content next to the capital headings. So you'll be able to see what am I supposed to view, video 1 and video 2 for this week. What am I supposed to review? You've got 2 PowerPoints to review this week. PowerPoint week 1 and then logic number 1. And those are non-narrated PowerPoints that you can upload and scroll through at your leisure. You'll have some reading to get accomplished this week. In this case, Moreland's book, first couple of chapters, and then The Love of Wisdom, the textbook, which is about that thick. You want to get through chapter 1. And then other reading and handouts, in this case, an article by Stan Wallace that looks like this when it's downloaded, called The Essentials of Postmodernism. And we'll talk a little bit about that. And then there's the reading report, number 1, due by the end of the week on Sunday, and that's focused on chapter 1 of the Love of Wisdom textbook, which is, of course, this book here. All the reading reports, and there's at least 7 of them in this course, are geared to the chapters in that textbook, which is the master textbook for the course. All right, so what are we talking about this week? What do we hope to get accomplished? By beginning with the Stan Wallace article, which I mentioned in the welcome and opening video a moment ago, really what we're wanting to do is glean this scholar, who is a great philosophy teacher and researcher and communicator with regard to especially late modern or postmodern philosophy and philosophical thought, glean his understanding of what makes postmodern or late modern thought what it is. He mentions, and it's true across the board, that there are several different ways to actually think about the times in which we live and the thought forms or the paradigms for thinking through the issues of life that exist within those periods of time, this one being the most recent, obviously, and current. Think of a thought form, by the way, when I use the word thought form or phrase thought form. Think of the thought form as kind of the little message bubble on your text. You know, when you're on your phone and you're texting someone, a little message bubble comes up. In a certain sense, with much more content, a thought form is like a message bubble. It's a message bubble that resides in our head that helps us to frame thoughts or topics or themes, most likely, of life. So the theme, for instance, of the meaning of life is a thought bubble or thought form in our mind that has a boundary that's been set by the experiences and learning that have attended our life up to the point at which we're beginning to consider the question within that thought form. The thought forms of late modern time are a specific kind of paradigm or lens through which we see life and ask questions about life. And postmodern thought form or message bubble is a specifically defined and characterized way of thinking about life that has evolved philosophically and developed in the times in which we live for reasons that we'll talk about as we go along in the course. Stan Wallace references the most common way to think about postmodern or late modern thought, which is a complicated terminology for the way people think generally today. when you hear the terminology postmodern thought, late modern thought, I like to use the phrase late because it indicates that we're not quite through the modern era yet, but we're almost there, versus post, which obviously means antecedent to or after the modern era. Again, we'll talk more about why I have that particular perspective in mind and terminology in mind, but the modern era is the era of time which extended basically from the Enlightenment period in Western Europe up into, say, about the 1960s. And again, we'll talk more in detail about this. Where we've journeyed from the 1960s forward is into a kind of post-chapter to that modern era, which was defined by certain ways of thinking about and viewing the world. Stan Wallace suggests that the most common way to think about postmodern or late modern thought, as indicated by even the terminology, is in a historical timeline sense, the way that I just described it. That post-modernity or late modernity, this time frame in which we're thinking the way that we are in this little thought bubble called late modern or postmodern thought, is the time period occurring just after modernity. Well, that's, common sense and kind of helpful and historical, and so it's easy to think about in terms of the calendar and your own age and generation and so on. But I think he makes a point in the article that's really, really important to begin this class with, and that is that to think about postmodern thought in terms of its pure content, that is to say, in terms of analyzing what the component parts of this little thought bubble are, and isolating out at least two that make it very distinct. That is to say, the postmodern thought bubble is a postmodern thought bubble and not something that kind of looks like it, when these two things are a part of it. One, the idea that we are rejecting anything universal in life that makes sense of all the particular details. Again, we'll talk more about what that language means and how we are to understand it as the class proceeds. But the idea that life is random and chaotic and that it doesn't really make any sense unless you want to try to make sense of it, and that's kind of a hopeless enterprise, is the idea of rejection of universals. The other, or number two quality of postmodern thought bubble is this idea that truth is what you make it. It's not something that exists outside of yourself or objective to or objectively viewed from yourself. That we can look out in the world, for instance, and see things that are true and not true, and that reality corresponds to truth in a direct connect sense. The idea that life is random and chaotic and makes no sense, and that truth is whatever you want it to be, are two essential qualities that define postmodern or late modern thought or thought bubble. When you're thinking like a postmodern person, those two things, life doesn't make sense, and truth is whatever you say it is, not something outside of yourself that can be verified. Those two things, which are very common in our culture, right, are what makes the postmodern thought bubble just what it is. I want you to start with that article because the whole point of this class is to explore and to get to know philosophy as a general knowledge base or column or category, at least in the most basic and functional sense, so that we can understand where philosophical thought began in ancient Greece and earlier on even, who the early philosophers and classic philosophers were, Plato, Aristotle, Socrates, and so on, how their thought forms have captured the most essential items and issues and ideas of human existence, how Christianity comes into that at a certain point with Jesus' own distinct teaching and thought forms and changes the kind of flow and trajectory of human thought, and then how philosophical thought, at least in the West, that is to say Europe and the Americas, has unfolded since the first century and on through the Reformation period and on through things like the Enlightenment period and the scientific revolution and the humanistic period that really changed and shifted the thought bubbles of Western civilization, primarily in Europe, prior to the settlement of the colonies and into the settlement of the colonies when we, as America, were born. Of course, we're well beyond that now by hundreds of years, and so we're going to trace out how we've arrived at the place that we've arrived in now. But all of that is a byproduct of philosophical thought, as it were, has rolled out in human history, and where it's sort of landed, on our front porch now, in the condition that philosophical thought and categories now exist. Beyond that, we're going to spend some time in chapter 1 of The Love of Wisdom, this book, and talk about logic and argumentation, which is a classical kind of zone or dimension of philosophical thought, which underlies all sense-making, honestly, and logic and deduction and the seeking after the truth that undergirds all of life and intellectual life in particular. That's a complex thing that we don't have time to get into, that you'll get into as you read through the textbook, but I just want to point you toward the slideshow that attends that, which is a detailed slideshow of what you'll find in chapter 1 and walks you through the structure of logic and argumentation in a very specific way. With that, we'll also ask you to watch through or look through or review the other PowerPoint, which is called the 4 Threads, where we're going to talk through in a very brief way why it's important to even get into any of this, why as God's people it's crucial that we understand the times in which we live and we know how to respond to them and to the people within those times. 1 Chronicles 12 is cited as an example of a group of individuals in Israel's history who understood the signs of the times and knew what to do on behalf of Israel to make sure they were fruitful and successful in their existence and growth as a country. We find that calling upon us as well in our times. We're going to talk about what a zeitgeist is, which is a weird word, but it's really the mood or the atmosphere of a time. In our time, our 21st century, right now, this offended, secularized, kind of fractured and oversensitized, overstimulated, massively confused culture that we're living in right now has a certain mood and atmosphere to it that's a zeitgeist, and it influences the way people react, respond, and communicate, and so on. And then we're going to talk about why all of this is important in terms of how we locate thought forms and those thoughts and processes and patterns as they emerge in our culture through what I call the 4 threads, which are pop culture, music, art, and film. We look across the humanities. We see the movies that are popular. We listen to the songs that are cool and happening. We consider the cultural trends and the memes and the stuff that goes on that expresses where people are at and what their thought processes and feelings are. And these are all byproducts of the zeitgeist or the atmosphere or mood of the time, and they all carry with them indicators of these thought form bubbles that are framing the way people think. All of this is part of chapter 1, week 1, the first section of this class, where we're getting into what it is that this class is truly about. So in a brief kind of overview way, I hope that you'll enjoy all this content and material. There is a lot of reading involved. I told you that to begin with. Please dig in. Please give it all you've got. It's worth the effort. And we'll see you online as we interact and post, and I'll look for your reading reports at the end of the week. Okay? So hang in there, work hard, God bless, and we'll see you soon. Thank you.